really a pleasure to introduce my colleague, Ambassador Adrian Basora. He directs the project on democratic transitions at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Prior to that, he served as president of the Eisenhower Fellowships, which maintain an organization in Philadelphia that maintains a global network of leaders throughout the world. He was the director of European Affairs on the National Security Council from 1989 to 1991, which means he participated in the reshaping of U.S.-European relations at a historic moment just after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And similarly, in 1992 to 95, he was U.S. ambassador in Prague, and therefore was present and a participant in the shaping out of Czechoslovakia into two new states, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, in what became known as the Velvet Divorce. So Adrian has been a participant in historic moments, and now from his research over the past 10 years into his democratic transitions in the post-communist world and the lessons for other parts of the world, we've asked him to take us into the 21st century. And so please welcome Ambassador Adrian Basora.
Thanks very much, Alan. Are the acoustics working all right to the back row? Thank you very much for the generous introduction. It's no mean task, as I hinted last night, to bring you fast forward for 237 years since the Declaration of Independence, about which we've heard so much. Professor Armitage did a magisterial job of bringing forward the impact of our Declaration of Independence on other nations. What he did not do, and what is left to me, is to talk more about the content of that, the democratic content, the ideological content of that declaration, and how it is playing out in the world today. And to do any justice to today, I really have to take into account the last century of history, perhaps starting from the time that Woodrow Wilson used the famous phrase, "make the world safe for democracy," introducing a whole period of American foreign policy that is still playing out today in certain ways. So let me also, it's also daunting for another reason to be here, although it's a great privilege, and I'm very pleased indeed to be here with you, and very admiring of this institute and of the time all of you, the teachers and the other scholars participating in this, have devoted to it. And to be part of the extraordinary, to see such extraordinary, really truly magisterial lectures that you have been, that have been prepared for you and presented to you over these past 36 hours. Is that right? About a day and a half, whatever it is. I'm not going to try to compete with these magisterial lecturers, but rather I'm going to try to bring you my own practitioner's perspective on the issues of democratic transition. Based on my own personal experience, some of which Alan has already summarized for you, and based on the last, particularly the last 6-7 years of research since I was invited to the Foreign Policy Research Institute to create the project on democratic transitions, which in fact has focused primarily on the post-communist countries, but certainly based on a very thorough survey of the literature of all the basic literature of comparative politics in general, and what many call transitology, post-authoritarian transitions, or democratic transitions more specifically, which has a very rich literature, has developed a very rich literature over the past decade or a couple of decades. I will also try to be brief in order to leave plenty of time for discussion. As I've discussed with some of you individually at lunch and at supper last night and in reception periods, I very much would like to have some dialogue and make sure that we talk about those things that most interest you and most interest your students. And I assume that in your classrooms you do interact with your students. And I would like to try to use that model. Proactive learning to me is a tremendously valuable model that I've learned a lot more about it in this generation than when I was in school myself. Alan already mentioned that I had the honor of serving as U.S. ambassador in Czechoslovakia, and then after the Velvet Divorce, the Czech Republic, at the time that they were beginning their transitions to democracy. And I was also extraordinarily fortunate to be at the White House National Security Council 1989 to 91 as the Berlin Wall fell, as the Solidarity government came to power in, let me welcome Maya and ask, Maya, why don't you join Peter up here in the front row? A dramatic entrance, Maya Otarashvili, originally from the Republic of Georgia, my research associate and coordinator, deputy coordinator of the program of the project on democratic transitions. We run the trains almost on time. All right. So, but when you put together these two assignments, National Security Council, 89 to 91, late 91, and then Czech language training and preparation for Prague, and the actual assignment for 3 years in Prague, I just feel so extraordinarily fortunate to have been present at the creation of what I think is one of the most successful and fruitful periods of American foreign policy ever. Also, one of the most promising and positive periods for the evolution of democracy ever. I'm talking about short periods, but the rest of my talk will be about the long periods, the long, difficult, and uneven periods of democratization that the world has experienced in the 237 years since the Declaration of Independence, and very much so since the fall of communism 24 years ago, or the beginnings of the crumbling of the Berlin Wall then in 1989. A central focus of my job at the National Security Council, of course, was to help develop the programs of support to democratization and to the transitions to market economies, which are a very important factor in this. So when, although after I left Prague and became president of Eisenhower Fellowships, I would focus mostly on the rest of the world and rather little on Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, because it's a global leadership organization. I did remain extremely curious when I was invited to how these policies that I had helped develop at the 89-91 period and helped implement 92-95, how they had actually worked out in practice. What worked, what didn't work? Was our optimism, were we too optimistic? Were we too ambitious? Did we do the wrong things? Could we have done a lot better? These kinds of questions. Once I got into it, and Harvey Sickerman, Alan's predecessor at FPRI, invited me to come and set up a project on this at FPRI, as I mentioned. So what I would like to share, as I've mentioned, my main scholarship, my main field experience has been on the post-communist countries, and I'm going to concentrate significantly, in large part on that. But I do want to also give you a little sense of the global picture and relate it to the post-communist experience and what lessons I believe have been learned from that experience. So let me just say that I just feel extraordinarily blessed. I will say once again, we have heard so many words about how the factors came together to create democracy here in Philadelphia 237 years ago. And I feel blessed to be here again today, reviewing these historic perspectives, which you will in turn review with your students. But also blessed to have been present at the creation of a new era in Central and Eastern Europe, to be present and to have had a very, very small role, but nevertheless been an actor in this play that led to the democratic transformation of Central and Eastern Europe and some parts further east. Fewer than I would like in the former Soviet Union, but nevertheless a considerable spreading of democracy. Okay. Let me then start with a very brief overview of the state of democracy in the world. So if, Peter, you will go to the first slide. This is based on the a publication of Freedom House, also available online, of course, one of the most venerable and respected nonprofit organizations in the United States in the field of democracy. And as you can see, in this particular annual survey, they divide the world into free, partially free, and unfree states. You can see the purple countries. These are where you have dictatorships or very strong, very authoritarian monarchies, etc. Very little freedom. The greens, of course, are the democracies. And that includes both consolidated democracies and what we will later, emerging democracies, what in definitional terms, as I will get to in a minute, will be called semi-consolidated democracies. Those are the greens, the green countries. The yellow states are what I would call hybrid regimes or transitional regimes, somewhere in between autocracy and democracy. Sometimes, all too often, when they have elections or other events, the press will refer to them as democratic or emerging democracies. They are not. They are in between, and it's a limbo. And if in the discussion we may, if time permits, we may usefully get into some of the pitfalls, what Levitsky and Way call pitfalls of competitive authoritarianism and the ability of authoritarian elites to perpetuate themselves generation after generation. Because using the symbols or misusing the symbols of democracy. Now, let me then just take you to the next slide to show you the progress in democratization. This is 40 years now. I'm not going all the way back to Woodrow Wilson and 100 years ago, where there were extremely few democracies. But in the last even in the last 40 years, by the way, if we went back to the late 40s and the immediate post-war and post-colonial period, there would have been another steep line of increase of democracies, which we won't get into today. But the numbers, this will be available to you online, and if you want to look back at the numbers all the way back, and at the Freedom House website, you can go back further. But as you can see, there are 90 countries that Freedom House now currently considers free. However, you might not be able to see at the top, 195 countries total is the base that they survey, and therefore this represents only 46% of the countries in the world, or virtually all the countries. I'm not sure they include Kosovo or a couple of other states that are not yet fully recognized by the UN. All right, so let's turn, however, to the next. So just one comment. The progress of if you look cumulatively, we've gone from 29% 29% Democratic to 46% Democratic. That blue line looks fairly flat. I mean, it's a slow progress and not certainly uneven rate of progress. And here you can see the fall of communism and sudden increase in the number of democracies. But nevertheless, if you go from 29% to 46%, do the math, that's almost a 60% improvement in the number of democracies in the world, or the percentage of countries that are democratic. If you could go to the next slide. Okay, this is the partially free countries, the category that Freedom House, which fits pretty well with the category that Freedom House calls transitional or hybrid regimes. And what I want to point out here is that there hasn't been anywhere near as much progress in this category as in the democratic category. Yes, when you start the graph way back in 72, 73, it was 25%. Now it's around 30%. But if you look here, as of 1975, you'll see fundamentally you have a straight line in terms of the percentage of countries. It's not all the same countries are in the mix. Some have become democratic. Others have become full-fledged autocracies again. So that's a category which is worth looking at and thinking about. If time permits, we can discuss it a little bit, as I said. Let me take you then, I think let me say just one more thing about these hybrid countries. Usually they have elections. Usually the press will express hopes that these elections will make a difference, that there is a glimmer of hope for democracy. Well, you've seen that in Zimbabwe, which is actually not in this group because they are a consolidated dictatorship. But notice, even there the press will say, oh, now maybe this time there'll be a movement towards freedom. And again, very often, in the majority of cases, it does not happen. So the misuse, one of the pitfalls of discussing democratization, democratic transitions, is the overemphasis on elections and the misuse of elections, including election monitors that say, oh, well, on election day, things went fine. Yes, but was it a free and fair election? Was it an even playing field? Did the public have access to information? Were they intimidated, et cetera, et cetera? These are some of the key questions. So they use the trappings of democracy. These elites or skillful individual dictators use the trappings of democracy, not just elections, but nominally free press or certain other trappings, to de facto simply perpetuate the existing elite, either the dictator, him or herself, or a very small elite. They may decide among themselves who will be the next president, but nevertheless, it's the same group of people continues to. And only when you get an elite split, in most cases, do you actually have a good chance of moving beyond this level of stagnant semi-autocracy. All right, now let me turn back, as I said, I'll focus mainly on the post-communist countries and on the definition of democracy. Let me say before we look at any of the slides that in my first couple of years as directing this project and starting it up, the project on democratic transitions, I found that this extensive literature survey that we did, that one of the real problems, or major problems, I would say, in studying transitology or democratic transitions in this day and age, is that there is no agreed definition of democracy. So I refer to the media calling some situations democratic when they are not, but in the scholarship, there are many differing interpretations. That is one reason I suggested Alan had suggested, and I put in a further plug last night, that you read the essay by William Hay in your folders, because he has a very thoughtful discussion of what constitutes real democracy, as opposed to what many people call illiberal democracy, a term made famous by Fareed Zakaria, which is also referred to in the William Hay essay. Let me just read you Will Hay's definition of democracy. Real democracy means liberal representative government under law, sustained by a political culture, I underline those words, political culture, that accepts open disagreement and demands accountability. This definition emphasizes the role of institutions in making a political order work. Representative institutions grew organically from particular challenges in the medieval and early modern period, and their repeated failure outside the sphere of Anglo-American governance underlines their fragility. Now that Will goes a little too far. He's a little too pro-Anglo-Saxon because, as we see, democracy has gone well beyond the Anglo-Saxon sphere over the last many decades. Nevertheless, what you heard so eloquently and with such eminent scholarship expressed yesterday, starting with Walter McDougall's presentation and a couple of others which talked about the particular confluence of circumstances 237 years ago. There was tolerance. There were differing views. There were a variety of interests and perspectives all brought together here in Philadelphia. They learned to compromise and work things, but nevertheless they got to some universal or let's say widely acceptable vision. That is worth keeping in mind throughout the, as we go forward in this discussion today. However, I would like to go a little bit further in defining. His is a very useful and better than most definition of democracy. What I found in this study of post-communist and other, a little bit of work, as you saw in the other essay on the Arab uprising countries. To me, if you want to go into real depth looking at these revolutions and potential transitions to democracy, it's important to use a slightly fuller and more precise definition, and actually not a single template of democracy, but to view democracy or democratic freedom and increasing democratization as being along a spectrum. And I'll define that spectrum to you in just a moment. Sorry. The best usage that I have found in the literature of this technique of using a spectrum effectively and measuring progress of democracy is that done by Freedom House for the post-communist countries. Unfortunately, a publication, annual, very thorough publication called Nations in Transition, analyzes each of the 29, now 30 post-communist countries, and each year gives them a grade on several factors that go into the proper definition of democracy. And it's based on a very carefully calibrated scale that I think we will, that has two basic types of democracy that includes in the definition of democracy, or what Freedom House used in terms of the free countries that you saw in the early graph. Could you go back to the free? Yeah. So the countries that are considered free meet at least the definition of a semi-consolidated democracy, which I'll give you in a moment, or else a fully consolidated democracy. Semi-consolidated democracy is one that has regular and reasonably fair elections, the freedom to associate and assemble, and basic freedoms of speech and press more generally. Now you can tell that is just the starting point of democracy. For it to be fully consolidated and really be a dependable long-term democracy, it has to have more. These countries that are called fully consolidated democracies have to have the following criteria. Meet the following criteria: all of the rights and liberties that are declared that are included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, well-enforced rule of law, not just nominal, strong free media, not just superficial, an open and diverse economic society, government institutions that are reasonably transparent and staffed by a capable, non-corrupt bureaucracy that is accountable to its elected representatives. Now we'll move in a moment to a few slides that give you a sense of how these measures look when applied to a few selected post-communist countries among those that we have studied carefully. But one general point I want to make before you see these several slides is that, as you recall, some of you have told me that your students don't recall the Cold War era, or even when Kosovo was not yet independent, or had not yet declared independence. But most of you will remember what communism was like, and that the Soviet Empire, by and large, they had a a system that was replicated almost everywhere. There were slight variations in Yugoslavia in particular, but fundamentally very tight, fully totalitarian, highly authoritarian control system, and the central control of the economy. So many of the characteristics of an all-powerful communist party. So they started from what seemed like a very similar starting point. But as you will see, the outcomes 24 years later are very, very different, country by country. So let's go to the first slide, the Poland slide. Poland, as you all know, was one of the front runners, in fact, played an absolutely critical role in the breakthrough of democracy after communism, the round table agreements, and then the election of a solid government, the solidarity government in September. Well, actually it occurred in June of 1989, but the Mazowiecki government took office in September of 1989. Absolute revolution. Just as the impact of the Declaration of Independence around the world was immediately felt, the breakthrough in Poland was immediately felt throughout the communist empire, the Soviet empire. And from the beginning, Poland has been one of the front runners in terms of democratization. But let me explain the scale to you that Freedom House uses. So one is absolute perfection in democracy. Anything above, the lower the grade, the higher you are, like an A plus. Anything above this dark line, anything that is 2.99 or less is considered a consolidated democracy. Between 3 and 4 is a semi-consolidated democracy. And then below that you have, to this level, you have the hybrid regimes at the level of 5, then semi-consolidated autocracies or authoritarian regimes, and then fully consolidated authoritarian regimes. These are the categories and the numerical scale that Freedom House uses. So being as high as Poland, even though the Poland line looks as if it isn't all that high, let me assure you that if you rated the city of Philadelphia on this, this line, it wouldn't be as high as that. So this is a pretty high standard. Okay, so the next slide. Yes, go ahead. No, I'm sorry. Let me just say a couple of things. Why, very quickly, for a moment, why, in our view, in the PDT, why it is that that Poland turned out so well and became a democratic country so quickly. I don't know how many of you remember the Jaruzelski regime. How many of you remember that he was a military officer and a nationalist, not simply a pure communist apparatchik? How many, most of you do know that it was a Catholic, predominantly Catholic country, and the church had not been entirely decimated or subordinated to the government, and that 30% of the land was owned by the peasantry, still, private ownership of land. So that the totalitarianization of Poland was not as extreme. Furthermore, Poland had looked westward for generations. We can't get into the entire history of Poland, obviously. Then you had Lech Wałęsa and other leaders of the Solidarity movement that started, in effect, an internal revolution a decade earlier. And you had a Catholic Polish Pope, in effect, exercising influence and persuasion. So you had a lot of favorable factors for Poland, and we'll get back to the factors favorable for democracy in a little bit more detail later. Let's go to the Czech Republic, where I had the honor of serving, as Alan had mentioned. As you see, by 1997, they too were at 1.5, which is an exemplary score in democracy. They were at the same level as Poland. And they, in fact, although they went down a tiny bit in 2001, 2002, they're, in effect, on an upward trajectory. And some of the things that made them special, that made them successful. Well, you've all heard of Václav Havel, who was head of the Charter 77 movement that started as a, well, and you also have heard of the Prague Spring in 1968. And you also know that the Declaration of Independence of Czechoslovakia was signed here. I was out of the room, but Alan pointed out to me that the previous speaker said that they had brought it to Independence Hall to sign. It was that important. The model of American democracy, or the freedoms that are spoken of in the body of the Declaration of Independence and in our 200 plus years of history, were important to Tomáš Garrigue Masaryk and the other founders of the independent Czechoslovakia. And then you had 20 years of democratic experience until the Nazi, let's say, protectorate and the temporary destruction of democracy from the outside occurred in 1938. So, and you also had the highest economic development and socioeconomic level, the most developed middle class in any of the communist countries in Czechoslovakia. At the time, communism was imposed in 1948 by the Soviet army and Politburo in Moscow, but Stalin, basically. Okay, let's move on then to the next country. Hungary, also by 1997, was considered a real front runner of democracy. They had done very well. They were economically, they had privatized, and their former communist country had changed its label to social democratic, and they were voted back into power and mismanaged the economy, a lot of corruption, admitted to by Prime Minister Gyurcsány at one point, former communist, young communist himself. But very importantly, and this is an example of how much of a negative difference one leader can make, Viktor Orbán was elected prime minister in April 2010 and proceeded systematically to use his electoral mandate and his personal charisma and skill and the counter-reaction against the previous government that made a lot of mistakes. So he was elected here. The previous government wasn't doing too well on corruption and a lot of other things. But here comes Gyurcsány. So you go from consolidated democracy to the point where right now they are flirting with dropping back into the semi-consolidated democratic ranks because Orbán has used with 52% of the vote, he got 68% of the seats because of their representation system, their proportional representation mechanisms. A constitutional majority, he amended the Constitution, packed the Constitutional Court, did a whole bunch of other things, intimidated the press. He's moved back towards high degrees of autocracy. So even a front runner after 20 years of democracy is not by any means consolidated forever. You have to go out and keep fighting and supporting democracy if you want it to survive and prosper. All right, let's move now to one of the least successful experiments in democratization. But let me just say something else. The scale the Freedom House provides only goes back to 2000. However, if you had looked at comparable measuring systems in the mid-1990s, this line would have been higher. It was considered either on the edge of or already being a semi-consolidated democracy in the early years of Yeltsin and the other reformers that came to power, and some of the reforms that Gorbachev had made before the Soviet Union broke up. This shows you, among other things, the power of one individual and one small coterie around him, the so-called Siloviki, who's around Putin, the power of one individual acting systematically and skillfully to take a country down from a lot of freedoms and some promise of democracy to fully consolidated authoritarianism. It can be done in just a decade or so. And my fear is that if Orbán is reelected, he can do that to Hungary. It'd be hard to go quite as far as Putin has gone, but that's the general direction he's been moving in. Let's continue very quickly, and I want to be mindful of the time. We'll leave time for discussion, so that we should start the discussion about 10 after 12, because 5 after 12. Okay, so that's good. No, that's right. I take my lead from the president here. It's an authoritarian system that we have at FPRI. Okay, so Russia, all right. Let's move on to Ukraine. Let's move on to Ukraine, which is in the hybrid category. But you all remember the Orange Revolution of 2004 and a reform government that came into office at the beginning of 2005, Timoshenko, Yushchenko. The Philadelphia Liberty Medal was given to Yushchenko, right, a couple of blocks from here, a few blocks from here, a few months after he was elected president. The great hope, Ukraine, democratic. Well, they squandered it completely. So you see that at this point, Freedom House was considering them very much on the uprise towards semi-consolidated democracy. This is the period, the 4 years that the Orange Revolution government, which was constantly bickering among itself and had a lot of corruption, et cetera, failed to make any further progress. And then you have Viktor Yanukovych, who was an old communist apparatchik, coming back in and getting a majority of the vote and taking the country systematically backward, not quite as steeply and as rapidly as Putin, but moving in the same direction. Very ominous. So that's another example of how things can regress. I stress the regression because at the time that I started this project, the conventional wisdom was that, you remember Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, the conventional wisdom was that this was the way of the future. Now that communism had been defeated, the Cold War was over, democracy was on the rise around the world, was on the move, and it was only a matter of time. We could help out here and there, but we would of course succeed. This was destiny. Let's go to the next slide. Georgia. Rose Revolution occurred in 2003. Saakashvili, great hero of the West, very strongly supported by the United States. What did he do? Well, he made a lot of improvements from 2003 to 2012 in the economy, very prosperous. He eliminated a lot of corruption, at least at the petty level. He modernized state institutions and made Tbilisi look like a very modern and prosperous capital. But he failed in a lot of other things. And above all this time was accumulating more and more power. If the United States had not leaned on him to permit a reasonably free election 1 year ago, he would have been reelected. So after, was it 10 years, Maya, that he had been in office at that point? Another term of office, you could see, I would have expected Georgia, a very good chance that Georgia would begin to creep downward, or at least stay stuck as a hybrid regime, and then Saakashvili would arrange perhaps for somebody else to replace him, as Putin did with Medvedev in Russia, replace him for a while, but Saakashvili's a young man, he could come back too for another set of presidential terms after a 5-year hiatus. That's one scenario. Other scenario is the same ruling elite, some of whom had enriched themselves during these years, these 10 very prosperous years, could easily have continued in power. I mentioned the United States intervention because external leverage can sometimes make a difference. Now, let's go to the final. Do we have another? No, I'm sorry. We'll get back to Chile and Latin, other regions of the world very briefly in a moment. Let me just read you very quickly, and we will put this. Alan tells me that we can have these remarks and slides put online for you. But let me go quickly through what I consider some of the, after 6, 7 years, 8 years working on these issues, some of the absolute key factors that correlate with success and that help to explain success in creating democracy and consolidating it, or that explain failure to consolidate democracy or to move ahead to democracy. And I'll go rapidly through them so we'll have time for discussion. I'll list just 10 factors. There are others. It's clearly a complex multivariate equation, and the weight of one factor or another is greater in some countries than in others. But recent extensive exposure to Western democratic societies through the media, through travel, through a lot of other things, that's one positive factor that correlates. And you know that, notice that Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary were the westernmost countries of the Warsaw Pact, and they had more exposure, East Germany as well. Prior direct experience with democracy, or at least some partial freedoms and pluralism. Third, leaders of high caliber in the early or intermediate stages of the transition. I should have said peaceful revolutions, peaceful bringing down of the old regime helps for that, to generate such leadership, and also a climate and a political culture that is positive. A strong sense of national identity, or better still, a history of prior existence as a state with its own self-awareness. Number 5, some degree of civil society or autonomous associational life and autonomous institutions within the society, such as the Catholic Church in Poland, or the Charter 77 movement in Czechoslovakia, or Solidarity in Poland. 6, the development of underground opposition movements during the dictatorial period, although that can cut two ways. You saw the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which was such a movement for 80 years or so. That wasn't necessarily positive, at least not so far in Egypt. It was quite negative. It's been quite negative so far in Egypt. 7th, a homogeneous society that is free of deep ethnic or religious conflicts. Eighth, a substantial middle class, which is often a corollary of reasonably high economic and educational level, economic development and high educational levels. Ninth, a fair and transparent approach to privatization after state ownership is ended, that disperses ownership of the reproductive assets in society more widely, not just a couple of oligarchs. So the Czechoslovak privatization, voucher privatization program, and willingness to bring in foreign firms to buy a lot of the state corporations was one positive factor in that country, and a couple of others followed that suit, that pattern. Finally, strong Western leverage, or strong leverage by foreign democratic countries, and leverage that is used intelligently to promote the transition to democracy. Those are 10 positive factors. On the negative side of the spectrum, the opposite side of each of those coins, of course, would be a negative factor. I'll just touch very quickly on one or two, on a few of them. So let's go back, Maya, to the first, the geographic, the map slide, the second slide, I guess it is. Okay, so less exposure to the West. Well, the communist empire used to come to here. And guess which are the most democratic countries? The ones furthest west. And the ones that are moving, that are that have some the hybrid countries, well, they're further east. And then the most authoritarian countries are, for the most part, very far to the east. Now, in other words, those countries, they were less developed societies. They had less, particularly in the Soviet period, less exposure to the West. They were much more remote, less economic development, et cetera, and many of the other factors. Of course, and most of those countries did not have any prior experience with democracy. I'm talking right now in the post-Soviet Union as such. Lower education and economic development levels and less of middle class. Again, I've already mentioned why. In some of these cases, like the former Yugoslavia, you have a further factor, a negative factor, intercommunal conflict or civil war, creating blood feuds, hatreds, violence, resentments. Poor early reform leadership, or in some cases, worse still, very skillful anti-reform leadership who pretend to be Democrats. So one example of this is the case of Russia. Yeltsin was a disaster. I mean, he was for some of the right things, but he was an alcoholic, totally out of control, let his family dominate, corruption, et cetera, et cetera. The privatization put money into the hand of, put state assets into the hands of a few oligarchs, et cetera. It was, and there was tremendous instability, devaluation, pensions weren't paid, et cetera, et cetera. It was absolute disaster, which killed any taste for democracy for at least a generation in Russia. Then you have Putin, eminently skillful and systematic leader, very strategic, systematically rebuilding the control center and mechanisms of the Kremlin. So what difference a bad leader at the beginning of the reform period can make, what difference a good, by which I mean effective and nefarious from the point of view of those who love democracy, leader like Putin. And there are many, Nazarbayev in Kazakhstan is another extremely skillful leader who pretended to be a Democrat and has run the country ever since. And the Aliyevs, father and son, the same thing in Azerbaijan. Now, one final point. I said strong leverage by Western democracies, or the West used to promote democracy. The opposite side of that coin is what is what I would call black knights, K-N-I-G-H-T, as opposed to a white knight. Stephen Levitsky, a scholar whom I bring to your attention, Stephen Levitsky and Lucan Way, in what I consider a rather seminal work in this field called competitive authoritarianism. They call the Black Knight phenomenon exactly the kind of role that Russia has played in its near abroad. Putin has tried to undermine with some success the democratization of Ukraine and other countries nearby. He tried to invade Georgia, but didn't quite totally unseat Saakashvili. But using the influence, the anti-democrats using their influence, and particularly in countries in close proximity or where they have some leverage, can be a very important factor against democracy. let me see if I can find my last page in order to sum up and make sure I sum up systematically. Those are the negatives. The negative side, the negative factors are the main pitfalls that work against. There are others, but those are the ones that I would emphasize. Now let's talk very briefly, in 1 minute or two most, I'd like to go to the rest of the world, starting with Chile, if you wouldn't mind. I start with Chile in part because some of you will remember the Allende regime, you will remember the military coup, you will remember that Augusto Pinochet took over and had a very hard authoritarian regime in Chile that was defeated and it was in effect unseated at the end of the 1980s. So by the time this chart begins, by the way, these are the Freedom House does not have as refined scores for some of the non-post-communist countries. So we've used the World Bank Voice and Accountability and tried to calibrate the scale. This is imperfect, but it's sort of a rough guide. So you see Chile by 1996 was already considered a consolidated democracy. Once again, it had a very long democratic history. It was one of the first democracies of Latin America before Pinochet. And so it regained democracy, and it's done very nicely since. I would consider this to be them to be roughly on a par with Poland or Czechoslovakia nowadays. Next slide. Mexico. Well, this is interesting. It's next door. You'd think the democratic diffusion, example of the U.S., etc. But no, the single dominant party system that the Partido Revolucionario Institucional had for generations in Mexico, even though in 1996 or thereabouts that monopoly was finally broken, you had a free election and a non-pre president. Nevertheless, it only went so far. The amount of corruption, some of the other things were built into the system. It's still not fully consolidated, and we'll see if now that Enrique Peña of the PRI has been elected, whether he keeps true to his promises and makes more from democracy, or keeps things fairly tightly controlled as they had been previously under the PRI. Next slide. Brazil. I would have thought that they would come out in the consolidated democracy category more clearly. And Freedom House, by the way, does consider them. The Freedom House would actually have this line just slightly higher. They do consider, they were among the countries listed as free, but just barely, not fully consolidated as a I'm sorry, free. Of course, free, as I said, in the world chart that you saw, free would be above this line. But anyway, some would argue that they're just already a consolidated democracy, but not as nicely as we would like. And part of the reason is very extensive corruption. Another part of the reason is weak relative ineffectiveness of the institutions of government, despite the fact that there's lots of freedom. Next slide. Okay, I want you to see different comparable levels of democratization in different continents just as part of this overview, very rapid overview. So you see Kenya is about on the same level as Brazil. There are African models, and there are some that are doing better. So if you go to the next, Ghana is considered very much on, some people would already consider it a virtually consolidated democracy, but it's certainly very close. And the British legacy there, as in Kenya, the institutions that they left behind, educational system, et cetera, are part of the explanation. Next, please, South Africa. South Africa has been, and here one individual, Nelson Mandela, is a large part of the explanation. What one man can do, what one leader who is a true Democrat can do. And a conciliator, and somebody who creates compromise. The things that happened here in Philadelphia to bring together our democracy. Okay, so there are several examples of democracy or soon to emerge democracies in Africa. Now, when you go to the north of Africa, the Arab Spring countries, interestingly, the new king made more reforms after Assad, made more reforms at the beginning, and they were flirting with being semi-consolidated democracy, and then things settled back into their own patterns where the old elite surrounding the king exercised more and more power. But then you had the Arab Spring, and the king announced, and his inner circle announced new reforms, and you have some creeping upward. In my view, in the longer term, if there is hope for democracy in some of the Arab uprising countries, Morocco is one of the ones one of the countries that have the best hope, through the gradual evolution of a monarchy, as in the case of England and a few other European monarchies, towards a more representative government, moving gradualism. Next, please. Tunisia is the greatest hope. Right now, it's considered by Freedom House or on these measures as calibrated to Freedom House, already an emerging democracy. And this is interesting. I mentioned that the Muslim Brotherhood, this underground opposition movement in Egypt, turned out to be a highly nefarious factor for democracy, at least in the person of Morsi and the way he conducted himself. But in Hada, the Muslim Brotherhood equivalent party, roughly equivalent party in Tunisia, was much more moderate. They engaged in the bargaining and coalition government and making trade-offs that you heard happened in Philadelphia 237 years ago. They did some of that same thing, right, as the awakening of the spring, the uprisings occurred in Tunisia. And so there may be some hope that Tunisia will become a democracy. If so, it will be the first Arab democracy, and hopefully will serve as a model. For those of you who were able to read my paper written 2 years ago about the Arab uprisings and the contrast between them, the similarities and differences between them and the post-communist, you will see that I was then, even though that was a period of great optimism, I said it was going to be a long, hard, and difficult road. And it sure has been, even more in the first 2 years since then, even more difficult and harder road than I expected. But you have to take a 20-year horizon if you want to look at the movements of history in terms of democratization. Now, I think I am a couple of minutes past the time that you suggested to start discussion. So let me give you a couple of my conclusions very quickly. If the past, let's say the past couple of decades, or the past even 4 decades, serves as prologue, and we heard from Dr. Armitage that this may be dangerous to say, but if it's prologue, then we can expect that there will be various pathways to freedom around the world in these and other countries, that there will be many failures, that the road will be long and winding and bumpy, and that progress will be frustratingly slow and uneven. Furthermore, it will be a long time before the extraordinary role that the United States played in the 1990s and the leadership that we showed, but also the results that we had in democratization then. A long time before that kind of big surge will happen again. And I don't see any other institutions or nations that can step into that void. On the other hand, there are some, like Putin and the Chinese, for example, who are working in the opposite direction. Nevertheless, perhaps I was born that way, I am optimistic that at least in the longer term, the ideas and the human aspirations that came together here in Philadelphia in 1776 are still alive and well. But successful democratization has always been a slow, gradual, organic process from the ground up. Again, as you saw, the U.S. can only help when there is a movement that has real roots domestically, a real demand for, and some people with a capability for democracy, a political culture, the beginnings of a political culture of democracy. Nevertheless, and here I come back to U.S. foreign policy, I believe that the United States can and should, albeit with modesty and with patience, with great patience, continue to assist in that painstaking but eminently worthwhile task of seeking to be a beacon of democracy around the world. And you, as teachers of the next generation, have an essential role to play in making that possible. So thank you. Now we have 10 minutes for questions. Well, you told me 10. You told me 10 until 12:25.
Ambassador Becerra, I read your article yesterday and I heard your presentation today with great interest, and I'm grateful for all the factors that you identified and that you presented here again today. I'm wondering, however, maybe you're not hesitant at reaching this conclusion, but it seems to me that you have not necessarily identified one factor that may be the weightiest one or the most important one. I wonder why that is, given that.
Well, what is it? What's the factor?
Well, I mean, I'm thinking the individual leadership, and I'm thinking that the natural experiment, so to speak, of Czechoslovakia going in one direction with President Havel, and then when you have President Kovács and President Havel going in different directions, then you definitely see a change there. It seems that, to me, that you made a very strong argument that the context matters, but that the leadership, individual leadership, really seems to be the preponderant factor. But then you kind of took that back. I felt.
No, okay. Let me be clear. I wasn't clear. I mean, because I needed to give up 5 minutes of my presentation. Otherwise, I would have. The role of individual leaders is extremely important. I did put it in my 10 enumerations of positive factors, and I came back to it among the negative factors with somebody like Putin, for example, or Yeltsin. So yes, individual leaders are extremely important, but democratization is a multivariant equation. Yes, a Mandela can make a huge difference, but only if there were other factors present. South Africa was a country with a very high level of overall economic development, high educational levels for at least a significant part of the population, percentage of the population. The same with Czechoslovakia. So Havel made a difference, but he had a lot to work with. The political culture, the socioeconomic structure, the economic ownership structure, there are so many other very important factors. So I would warn you against a single factor analysis, but within that, I think that some historians do give proper credit to the role of individual leaders. Others say no, it's a whole bunch of many other factors, and really it's just hero worship to give too much credit to one man or woman. I think that individuals, I've seen it up close, they can make a huge difference. And that means all of you. Why did I end with my pitch to you as high school teachers? Because your students can make a difference in their communities. Or who knows, one of them may become president of the United States a few years from now. So please keep in mind that you're developing young leaders. Jason? I'm sorry, who's next?
Okay.
Why don't you identify them? Yeah.
Hi, Ambassador. I just have a question about the dictators themselves. I'm always fascinated by the fact that a country like Chile, in 1988, General Pinochet, he essentially puts the vote to a people in plebiscite, and they vote no, he should not remain in power. He gives up power in 1990 and steps down, and then Chile has essentially been a consolidated democracy ever since. But then we have countries like Nigeria, I believe, where they had an election, and during the presidential inauguration, it was broken up by the military, and now it's happening in Egypt. The military is once again taken over. So why is it that some dictators would just step down with great ease, and then others are so resistant to the change?
Can we speak off the record here? Oh, okay. Well, okay. Then I won't mention specific names. But I do have personal knowledge of how that plebiscite was engineered, how Pinochet was convinced to conduct a plebiscite, which in effect was his political suicide. And the way it was done was that an extremely skillful ambassador with strong backing from his headquarters was able to establish personal relationships with other members of the junta, because Pinochet was there because of a military junta that involved all the military services. And he was an army officer, but people from a couple of the other services were a little bit more open-minded. In effect, he was persuaded that he really had to have a plebiscite in order to legitimize the continued rule, his continued rule and that of the military. Otherwise, he'd be discrediting the military. He was confident that he would win, but he didn't, because people were unhappier than he realized. It had gone to his head. He thought he was a great man, that of course they would re-elect him, and he lost. He was planning to in effect declare that very day of the election, that evening, this particular member of the junta, who had been speaking, who had been in effect helping to create an election that had some real freedom to it, a truly free election. He arrived, the junta was called together at the presidential palace that evening for Pinochet, where Pinochet was planning to say, we're going to declare these, there was the elections voided by, create an excuse, invalid procedures, et cetera, et cetera. But this particular member of the junta deliberately arrived late to the meeting when the press was outside the presidential palace. And they asked him, how did the referendum go? And he said, the opposition won. He announced that publicly to the media that night. And therefore, the cat was out of the bag. Therefore, Pinochet and the junta couldn't take it back. And that's how Chile regained its freedom. So one man on the junta and one diplomat on the outside working together can make a difference. That's the story. Yeah.
Well, first, wow on that story. But, a question about social
Out of the lights that
cohesion.
are shining, yeah.
So Hay makes a point about social cohesion, and you make a strong point in your essay about Shia and Sunni and fundamentalists. And I guess what I'm wondering is I can see how a number of your 10 points can be developed and nurtured. Can social cohesion also always be developed, or are there points where it just may not work?
Can you develop social cohesion is your question? Well, first of all, political culture, although a very important subdiscipline of political science, is, in my view, not as fully developed as it deserves to be. And I don't claim to be a political scientist or a political culture specialist to give you a definitive answer about that. I believe that leaders like Mandela can make a difference in developing social cohesion, but it's difficult to do. Václav Havel inherited a country when he came to power when he became president, in January 1990. He did not want his country to divide. Slovaks and Czechs got along very well. There weren't any problems. But demagogues on the Slovak side and demagogues on the Czech side began to see their own personal ambitions. They began to, demagogue. And they created a dynamic that ultimately led to the split of the country, despite Havel's great persuasiveness and 2.5 years of effort to try to keep the country together, a country that had great social cohesion. I give that as an example of how difficult it can be. Social cohesion is important. We've lost a lot of social cohesion in the United States over the last several years. And we used, that was one of the great glories of American democracy. Can we regain it? It's easy to destroy, not quite as easy to rebuild. That's my view of social cohesion. Very important for democracy, but a delicate and fragile flower to be tended.
Okay, last question to Mark Yanor.
Do you only get great leaders in countries that already have many of the other prerequisites?
I don't think so. I don't think you need to restrict yourself to countries that have the other prerequisites. I consider Gandhi one of the great leaders of the 20th century in terms of developing freedoms and human dignity, et cetera. And surely India was a country with very low economic and educational levels overall. The one big thing that they had one positive thing going for them, that was the British civil service system and a small educated Indian elite that could gradually take over. But no, I don't think, I think it's, as in human evolution, what the biologists called a sport. In other words, you can have a sudden deviation that is not determined by the average of all the other citizens of that country. Obviously Gandhi benefited from British education. There were certain other things, but that does not mean that India had all of these preconditions or all of these favorable factors, the 10 favorable factors I listed, the other 9 favorable factors that I listed, and I could have listed another 5 or 10 as well. So one man can make a difference and doesn't have to be predestined as to in which country he or she will emerge, in my view.
And with that, I want to thank you.
Thank you.